So this video might be a little bit hard to follow. If the pieces don't fit immediately, try watching this video again. I'm going to do my best to explain this as simply as possible. Evelyn Farkas is the smoking gun for the Obama wiretapping fiasco. First, let's start with who she is. Well, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia for the Pentagon from some point in 2012 to Halloween of 2015. She's also a senior fellow on the Atlantic Council. What is the Atlantic Council? Well, according to their website, the Atlantic Council promotes constructive leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the Atlantic community's central role in meeting global challenges. The Council provides an essential forum for navigating the dramatic economic and political changes defining the 21st century by informing and galvanizing its uniquely influential network of global leaders. Through the papers they write, the ideas they generate, in the communities they build, the Council shapes policy choices and strategies to create a more secure and prosperous world. And in this New York Times article, you can get a better idea of what they do. The arrangements involve Washington's most influential think tanks, including the Brookings Institution, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Atlantic Council. Each is a major recipient of overseas funds, producing policy papers, hosting forums, and organizing private briefings for senior United States government officials that typically align with the foreign government's agendas. So, in other words, they're lobbyists. With that information out of the way, let's watch this following video.
The other big story of the day, you actually knew about this attempt to get and preserve information, and full transparency, we're doing some work yourself. Tell us about that.
Well, I was urging my former colleagues and frankly speaking, the people on the Hill. It was more actually aimed at telling the Hill people, get as much information as you can, get as much intelligence as you can before President Obama leaves the administration, because I had a fear that somehow that information would disappear with the senior people who left. So it would be hidden away in the bureaucracy, that the Trump folks, if they found out how we knew what we knew about the Trump staff's dealing with Russians, that they would try to compromise those sources and methods, meaning we would no longer have access to that intelligence. So I became very worried because not enough was coming out into the open, and I knew that there was more. We have very good intelligence on Russia. So then I had talked to some of my former colleagues, and I knew that they were trying to also help get information to the Hill.
A lot going on today.
Yeah.
Mark
That's why you have the leaking.
Exactly.
People are worried.
Well, that's Emily Farkas, and it sure seems like she openly admitted to receiving classified information. In fact, one thing I like to point out here is her last sentence. But that's why you have the leaking. Now, let's listen to what she had to say today in Boston.
You have been in the news yourself on a related thing based on an interview you did on MSNBC with Mika Brzezinski earlier this month.
And only in the dark news.
Well, but let me quote you in part, and if you feel it's unfair because you said had a lot to say, you'll amplify. I was urging my former colleagues, and by the way, you left in 2015, we should say.
On Halloween
of
2015.
Perfect,
yeah.
Is it not? I was urging my former colleagues, and frankly speaking, the people on the Hill, to get as much intelligence as you can before President Obama left the administration, because I had a fear that the Trump folks, if they found out how we knew what we knew about the Trump staff dealing with Russians, that they would try to compromise those sources and methods. Critics have said, and supporters of Trump, this is the smoking gun that suggests, in fact, there was at least a will, if not a way, to do the surveillance of Donald Trump or people in his operation that his supporters are suggesting. You're shaking your head no. Why doesn't it mean that?
Because I never mentioned surveillance, I never mentioned leaking, I never mentioned hacking.
Wait, what's that? She didn't mention leaking? Well, let's play that one again.
I never mentioned leaking.
Yep, she says she didn't mean... Yep. Yep, she says she didn't mention leaking. Well, isn't the internet a real bitch? Because you did, Evelyn. Listen to the sound of a lie.
I never mentioned leaking.
That's why you have the leaking.
I never mentioned leaking.
That's why you have the leaking.
I never mentioned leaking.
That's why you have the leaking.
I never mentioned leaking.
That's why you have the leaking.
So, what else is there? Well, have I got a fresh, spicy meatball for you? Do you know who else works at the Atlantic Council? This guy, Dmitry Alperovich. Who is he? He co-founded CrowdStrike. Well, what is CrowdStrike? They're the ones that made the initial claim that the DNC was hacked by Russians. How did they make this claim? Well, this is where it gets tricky. CrowdStrike made the claim that 2 Russian groups, Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, attacked the DNC and got the Podesta emails. They say this based upon code that was found on the email servers. What has come under scrutiny is their claim that Fancy Bear was also responsible for a malware infection into Ukrainian artillery that destroyed 80% of their artillery. In fact, it didn't destroy 80% of their artillery. Ukraine stated very plainly that this was false. Coincidentally, CrowdStrike very recently reneged on the severity of the claim, pushing the number back to 15 to 20%. Isn't that weird? Huh. Well, isn't it weird that we were able to link Farkas with CrowdStrike that easily? Huh. Isn't it bizarre that the co-founder of CrowdStrike is Russian? Huh. Isn't it just a tiny bit peculiar that Farkas just so happened to work in Russian-related things? Huh. Above all else, isn't it just the strangest thing that the media isn't reporting on this at fucking all?